Thank you everyone for joining us for Singh-Ray's webinar of the month with Vinny Colucci. We are talking tonight about 4 keys for making great images. And these I think are important keys for any image, whether it's film or digital or mirrorless. These are things that translate to any variety of photography. By way of introduction to our presenter, Vinny Colucci is an award-winning photographer. He has been an active photographer since 1979, and he's shooting professional since 1995. He has photographed North Carolina to the West Coast and north to the Canadian Rockies. Along with his wife, Annette, Vinny conducts nature and wildlife photography workshops throughout the year. He is an active outdoorsman and a member of Nikon's Professional Service and Wimberley Professional Service, think tank Mindshift affiliate, and technical advisor, as well as a Singh-Ray filter ambassador and technical advisor. His images have appeared in multiple publications, including Nature Photographer Magazine, New Bern Travel Magazine, Microwave Journal, Smoky Mountain Journal, and various other publications. He has also authored and co-authored multiple books. His speaking engagements have included Popular Photography Magazine, Recreational Equipment, REI, St. Augustine Photo and Birding Festival, Orlando Wetlands Festival, Crane Festival, and universities around the country. So welcome back, Vinny, and I will let you get going.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate you all sitting in and spending part of the evening with us. I want to thank Michelle for emceeing this and putting all the technical stuff together so it works. She makes me look good. And I want to thank Singh-Ray Filters for putting these webinars on every month to bring education to all you, and not just about filters. We're really here to teach photography, and I applaud Singh-Ray for that, and thank you for that. Tonight we're going to be talking about 4 keys for making great images. And of course, right away, I have a technical glitch, and I don't know why. There we go. 4 keys for making great images. The concept came up from years and years ago when I was teaching with a dear friend, Bill Fortney, and he put a program on called 4 Keys for Great Images. I love this program so much, I stole it. And of course, with his permission. So I've been teaching this on and off throughout the last 20 years or so, and evolved it a little bit, and bringing you a brand new one tonight. The concept of 4 keys for making great images, it's not a high-tech program tonight. It's almost a philosophy program, and really, whether you're shooting a high-end SLR or mirrorless camera, or your iPhone, or point and shoot. These concepts are important for every image to be complete. And no matter how good you do technically with things like depth of field and composition and so forth, these 4 elements that we'll talk about tonight and show tonight are the ones that complete a photograph and make it worthy to present to somebody else. So those 4 keys: appropriate light for a subject. And I have to apologize ahead of time. I have a little bit of a post-nasal drip cough. So I got my cough drops and something to drink over here. So appropriate light for the subject, clearly defined subject, effective use of foreground and background, and the correct conditions to photograph in for your particular image that you're trying to create. And again, it's not like you have 2 out of the 4 or 3 out of the 4. All 4 elements are key to every photograph. And as we go through the images and the camera settings that I've used to capture them, and a little bit of the storytelling as we go from beginning to end, keep in mind, look at the building block of the images, particularly ones that really look good to you. Do they incorporate these 4 keys? So we'll take each key one at a time, and then we'll talk a little bit about the whole package in the conclusion of this. Again, it is a low-tech approach to photography. Light as it stands. Do we alter light to get our good light? Conditions, do we alter our conditions with things like filters? Depth of field for foreground to background. to sort of show what we see and what we want our viewer to see when we take our image home. And can we identify our subject within the image? That's what we're going to be looking at. And even this image that I'm showing here, a little bit of an action image with snow flying. We could see that we have good light, and the use of foreground to background, background being blurry, so our image pops off, the foreground not stealing away from our image. These are the things we're going to look at one by one as we go through this. You'll see that each of these images, I don't think I missed any through the program. I do have my camera settings and the cameras that I use to do it. But before we get into to this, basically the equipment that I use, I'm shooting with Nikon Z mirrorless equipment with an assortment of lenses. Obviously, I do have an assortment of filters that I use, and since the end of 2018, I went 100% mirrorless. But I want to make this statement: none of that has to do with photography. My style of shooting hasn't really changed since, I would say, 1995, when I was shooting my F5 film camera. The concept of all the gadgets and stuff to help us along in our new computerized cameras are excellent, but the basic principles of photography are the same. So I like to keep that in mind. And when I teach in the field, I try to make sure people understand how to be photographers first and then computer experts on that camera second. I do use a filter holder, especially for landscape photography. And my love for filter holders, at least so far, has been the older style leaf filter holder. And the reason I like it, it has the interchangeable rings like a lot of filter holders do. But you can see there's a lot of screws around it. And that's because where it holds the filters, I'm able to loosen those screws. If I pick up a filter that has a gasket and it's a little too tight to slide in, I could loosen the screws, slide the filter in, tighten it back up. It gives me some variation. And so I've actually go on eBay and look for the older style leaf filter holders and sort of stock up, so I have some to loan when I do go out and teach workshops and people want to try a filter holder. But Singh-Ray sells filter holders. There's many places you can get different filter holders for the size filters that you're using. And but in landscape particularly, filter holders allow me to slow down, allows me not to scratch up my filter by just holding it in front of the lens. And it allows me to be precision when I want to place a filter in exact position, such as a graduated filter, graduated neutral density filter. Also, heated photography. This, even though VR and image stabilization has gotten so good, I do a lot of bird photography now, handheld, especially back in landscape world. You can't beat a good tripod. These are some of the tripods and ball heads that I use. There's many good ones out there. Get Don't Really Write Stuff or Upper End, but I shoot a lot, and it's my profession. There's some really great mid-price tripods now. Siri has them. There's 3 or 4 companies that produce really good mid-priced graphite tripods, and there's also some really good ball heads out there. I try to pick a ball head that uses a universal arc plate, so I'm not stuck buying a specific plate just from one company. So whether I'm using a Kirk ball head or a Really Right Stuff ball head, all my plates work. All the plates on my wife are interchangeable with my stuff, so we could go back and forth with no problem. But this is what we're here for. We're going to start with appropriate light for the subject. Listen, if we don't have light, we can't make a photograph. There's got to be some kind of light to record on your digital sensor, or in the older days of film. Some people are still shooting film now. You need to absorb light to create this image. This image was created at Glacier National Park, Lake McDonald. It was a long shutter speed, 10 seconds. You could see that the golden hour after sunset is what I was after here. And the group that was with me all got similar images. And but again, the right light for the subject is really important. Notice I used a graduated filter because what I was trying to do, and this image, just because of the way the slide is, had more water in front than what's shown here. The graduated filter, and yeah, it has a name on. We have the Vinny Colucci extended grad filter, is a longer graduation than most graduated filters, and it allows a balance of exposure for the foreground into the brighter light to make for a smoother transition in from the bright light to the more shadowed area, in this case, the water. I did use a polarizing filter because particularly this sunset was behind me and to the left. So the polarizer did pop the contrast a little bit. And I have a tendency to leave a polarizer on all my lenses as my standard filter. And if it really is in the way or it's getting too dark to use a polarizer, I might switch out to like a high lux filter because that still adds a little contrast and a little warmth. But I have a tendency to keep a polarizer on every lens 90% of the time. So you'll see that a lot throughout these slides, that in my list of filters, there's a polarizer on it. Picking the time of day for proper light will yield different results. Whether you're shooting early morning light or warm afternoon light will affect it will affect the image. If I shoot at 3 o'clock versus shooting at 5 o'clock, or if I get up at 4 a.m. and wait for the light to come up for a sunrise, the light's going to change, and it's going to constantly change. And you keep shooting and you're going to get 2 or 3 different looks at the same subject. So pick the time of day based on your own experiences and the locations you're at. And then you'll get 2 or 3 different types of photographs. But again, all about light. Here, this is Sparks Lane, Cades Cove on the Tennessee side of the Smoky Mountains. If you look at the left, this is a classic shot in the morning. The sun's coming up to the far left. And so we are going to alter the light a little bit because we use the polarizer. Why? Because as the light strikes the trees, when it breaks over the horizon, the polarizer takes a lot of shine off the trees and pops the color, pops the contrast. But we had to start with good light. If this was an overcast day, I couldn't do this. Well, on another trip, I went back to Sparks Lane on the far right. I think it was a trip several months later. I was going through Sparks Lane. It was sort of the middle of the day. It was like 2 o'clock, not the best time to do a landscape shot. So I changed the light again. I took an I-Ray 830, nanometer infrared filter and did this exposure. So I used the harsher bright light to my advantage. Of course, that particular filter yields long exposure times. As you can see here, this was 5 minutes at f8, which gave me those nice wispy clouds up above. And we're going to talk about conditions later, but we'll mention it now. You can't do this on a windy day because then everything would be too blurred. But if it's just a little breezy or if it's nice and calm, you could pull this off with a long 5-minute exposure or a longer, depending on how your sensor reacts with an infrared filter. Late afternoon light. This is Jordan Lake Dam out in North Carolina. This time of year, actually, between January and the end of February, you go to the dam, there's usually no less than 12 to 18 eagles up in a tree ready to fish. And not the prettiest water coming off the dam, but in the late afternoon when the sun's coming down over my right shoulder, if you're facing this eagle, you get this warm look to the eagle. And as they're going down to the water, we have this nice grass line along the top of a hill that makes a nice background. So as we look at our subject and how it enters into the light, again, that's what creates the light necessary for making this image. On a gray overcast day, not such an impactful image unless you want to shoot it in black and white. I used a high lux filter here because it was getting late. The sun was almost directly over my right shoulder, so polarization didn't have a big effect. But the high lux filter, which is really just a clear UV filter, adds a little warmth and adds a little contrast pop. It's the only clear filter I ever use because it adds those 2 elements which are missing in a lot of other clear filters. Also makes a really good protection filter if you don't want a polarizer on it on every lens. You could stick a less expensive Hilux on there. Early morning. One of the things about early morning shooting is you got to get up. I'm getting a little older. Sometimes I don't like to get up so much. But yeah, there's being someplace before sunrise, waiting for the light to come up. And this was in the Everglades, I'm waiting for the light to come up, and it's coming up slowly. And this great blue herring was just pruning itself and cleaning itself by the water. And then the light hit it on the right side, and it almost exploded in my face. So the light here is what makes this work. And the light in the background on the water is nice and even. So it gives me a nice palette that my subject pops off of. Again, I used a polarizing filter on this, and that's to take any of the reflections and sheen. Now, a lot of people say in wildlife, you still use a polarizing filter? Yeah, whether it's grizzly bears or whether it's egrets or eagles. If I have an opportunity to polarize in a direction where my subjects might be, I do, because it also brings out detail in the feathers. It actually helps tame the scattered light, and it gives your image an appearance of being sharper. And so, yeah, I try to polarize whenever I can. Now, sometimes you can't. Things happen too quick and you don't have a chance to polarize. So the worst that can happen is you shoot it the way it is. Telephoto lens compressed. That's why we have that soft image in the background. And also, this was an f4 lens, which also gives me a nice bokeh in the background to get that smooth color palette. But it still all starts with great light. So we want to look for great light. Glacier National Park. This is a mini glacier. Got to be there early, 5 in the morning, waiting for the sun to come up. And then right after the sun gets up above the horizon, starts to light these mountains. You get this great light off the top of the stonework. Just great light on the subject, makes the subject. I used a polarizing filter that helped take some of the sheen off the water, and I used a 2-stop graduated filter, just a regular grad, on a little bit of a diagonal from the right down, just to darken where that reddish rock was and blend it into the rest of the foreground. But again, you have to be there for the light.
Did you research these locations ahead of time to find out, what side of the mountain you want to be standing on, et cetera?
Yeah, if you haven't been there before, you need to research it, and with all this information on the internet, you could Google Glacier National Park best locations for photographs and times, and you'll get that information before time. But it takes a lot of experience. Myself, Bill Fortney, and Tony Sweet did a big event in Charlotte, North Carolina some years back. And we all did a presentation, and we did a question and answer, sit on a stool, people asking us questions. And one of the questions that came up is, how do you guys get so many great images and you're in those locations all the time? And Bill Fortney actually took that one question. He said, send this. You're not going to like what I say. Go to every national park over 20 years, 3, 4, 5 times, and you'll get a handful of good images. It's not like every time a pro goes out, they come back with 2,000 great images.
Right.
Just like people that are non-professional, and I don't believe in amateur. Everybody out there has value in their photography. But yeah, sometimes it's experience. Sometimes it's talking to locals. When I was in Glacier, on the east side of Glacier National Park, when I first started to teach in Glacier, I think it was 2006. I taught an event there with Bill Fortney and Scott Kelby. And one of the things I did in preparing for the event, because I got there early, was stop and talk to the rangers. I stopped and talked on the Indian reservation to some of the residents there, because they know that park inside and out. And they made some really great suggestions to bring to groups to. But as I do those events and we find great things to bring our groups to, I make notes. So if I'm going to Glacier National Park, I have a digital file on my computer that says images I've taken in Glacier National Park. And I can look at the metadata and know the settings. So I could get a head start on getting people set up and what they need to do to get close to a great image. Because when the sun comes up, this light lasts all of 5 minutes and it's gone. So you really need to be prepared. And one of the advantages we're going with a leader that's been there is that they know those settings that they've used before to get an image like this. So yeah, research is key. I spend a lot of time, if I haven't gone someplace, even if I've been there before, if I haven't been there in a while, I'm spending hours and hours researching because I want to, it's a lot of money for me to go too. So it's, I want to make my time there worthwhile. Clearly defined subject. Well, what do we mean by that? One of the things I have found in taking people around and doing critiques at the end of my workshops or doing presentations on my own and watching other instructors do presentations. And then I sit back and watch other folks do presentations like at camera clubs and so forth. What I find one of the big mistakes is that they try to put too many subjects into an image, or it's too cluttered to the point where you can't really pick out what the person was thinking about. What's his subject? Is it the waterfall? Is it the waterfall and that beautiful set of trees to the left? You have to be clear when you photograph. So if somebody looks at your image and says, oh yeah, that's what he's trying to show, and the rest of it is supporting. In the case of here with this mama bear and adolescent coming up behind her, again, great light. We're off the subject of light, but watch these building blocks as we go through here. Great light, clearly defined. The face of the bear is clear. Even the cub, I probably took 25, 30 shots, and there's multiple ones where, you know, the younger cub, the younger bear, his face was down in the weeds. He was forward. You had to get a shot where both faces were clear. But the baby, the younger bear is really the supporting subject. The mama bear is the main subject. And of course, the weeds, you know, in the field they're walking through is just the environment. So, but the subject has to be clear. And if it takes you more than a few words to explain your photograph, then you didn't do a great job. It's got to tell a story pretty much on its own. We know what this story is, you know, just you could imagine a story, what's happening here. Even though both of these cougars were up in a tree, sitting for what seemed like forever, but it was really only about eight minutes or so. With all that, you know, tree foliage around them, they were sort of buried. And it wasn't until this mama took a leap and created a line to bring you back to the baby, that otherwise the baby would just disappear into the tree line. So you need that clearly defined subject. The other 150 shots I have of her sitting up there with the baby were cool, but they sort of disappeared into the trees in the background. So it wasn't an image I was willing to present. But when she leaped and I was lucky enough, another thing Bill Fortney once said, the more you shoot, the luckier you get. Here you go. That created the clearly defined subject, and her baby became the supporting subject. And of course, the trees around it, you know, surrounding, that's what the environment we're in now. And that's what tells the whole story. But that clearly defined subject. Also, I'm going to keep going back to the building block. Great light on the mom particularly. Well, I think I wanted to make a point though, back here. Was it here? No. Yeah, polarizing filter. When you're sitting looking at this, I can't polarize when action's happening. But if I know I'm working with a bird or I'm working with a mammal, any wildlife, I polarize before, as I set up to start my patients waiting, I polarized that direction because I knew if anything happened, it would be in that direction. And then I forget about the polarizer after that point. So yeah, you can't wait for the action to polarize or you're going to miss the shot. Sometimes you have to just take a chance because of experience and polarize in the direction you think your subject's going to move in. Sometimes, especially, obviously, I'm showing more wildlife here because I'm probably more of a wildlife photographer. This the little cub on the left was in the Smoky Mountains. On the right, I was in Montana with this wolf in the tree line. They're going to be buried in here. You have to look for opportunities for their eyes to be clear so you could get a shot. But you could also use the environment around them to tell the story. Don't forget that. You know, this wolf, for example, coming up behind the trees, you know, I took shots, but they weren't great because the trees were blocking until it passed through the trees. It almost looks like it was jailed there. The little cub, the only thing that made me nervous with that, because guess where Mama was? Mama was down below. And so I was careful, keeping my distance and shooting from afar. But yeah, I was waiting for that moment when the subject is clearly defined. And that's the image you want to show. And again, you could see I used a polarizer. Gee, I think I use a polarizer a lot, Michelle.
I think you do. So when you're getting action shots like this, how many times do you click that button to get these images?
That's a great question. I do another program. Maybe I'll do it for Singh-Ray. I do a program on how I shoot, you know, the settings. But the real secret here is, and I've done this since my F5 days, which was a film camera back in the 90s. I set my camera on continuous firing. I set it on continuous autofocus. I leave it on dynamic autofocus. I love Nikon's dynamic autofocus, and it's gotten better and better and better over the years. Even on my Z9, it is incredible. When I start using some of the little fancy things like eye detection, I don't use that. I use basic photography. I shoot in short bursts. Now, if I'm shooting my Z6 II, it shoots at 12 frames a second. So if I do a short burst, I'm probably picking up about 8 frames for a short burst. My Z9 shoots at 20 raw images a second. It is fast. So I shoot a short burst. I got a lot of images. I've got 20 images of the same thing. But Roland, forgot his name. Oh man, great landscape photographer. He's done some filters for Singh-Rays before he passed away years and years ago. He was doing a workshop and he was doing a macro setup and he was shooting film, and he set up and he unloaded 36 exposures all on a stationary macro plant. And the question was, why did you shoot? And you didn't change anything. You picked up your cable release, you fired 36 exposures because that's what was on a roll of film, and you didn't change anything. And he said, yeah, but one of those images are going to be sharper than the rest. As your mechanical camera settles and environment around you settles, like people walking and vibrations in the ground, one of those images will be just a little bit sharper. So I've always shot in short bursts. And
we have a couple of people in the audience that know that story, and it's Galen Rowell.
Yeah, Galen Rowell. That's it. I went brain dead. That's what happens, Michelle, when you start getting older like me. And that's a famous thing that he did. And the beauty of that is that I took away from when I read about that was shooting in bursts gives you your best opportunity to get the perfect image. But later, what I found is, because I do a lot of bird photography, that'll do a lot of fast moving mammal photography and slow moving mammal photography. Shooting in short bursts sometimes gets me a facial expression. Even a bird flying by, an eagle flying by, gets me a facial expression I wouldn't have even noticed. It happened so quick. So I might have 10 images of the same thing, or a bird going by, barely moving, you know, from left to right, and I have 20 images of that. One of them, the bird looked and noticed me. I didn't know he noticed me. Or looked down and noticed a fish. Now that's the keeper. And I wouldn't have got that trying to shoot a single shot. I would have had to shoot in bursts to get that. So it's a little bit of luck, but with a good panning technique, that luck starts to repeat itself over and over and over again. Love alligators. My wife Annette, you know, I had gotten remarried little over 11 years ago, That's the only thing she promised. I used to do a lot of gator shots in the Everglades in Orlando Wetlands Park, and I had no problem getting in the water to get a closer to eye level shot with a gator. So she made me promise not to do that so much anymore. At least not without letting her to raise my life insurance, at least while I was doing that, so she could get a prize at the end if I made a mistake. But yeah, I love alligators. But I have to wait. Look, we talked about light, building block, light, clearly defined. The back alligator, intentionally, I shot this a little shallow depth of field. I wanted that to blur out a little bit, but I wanted enough in there so you knew it was an alligator. My main subject is this one in the front. Eye is sharp, great light coming through its mouth, and yeah, a polarizing filter took a lot of the water reflections out. And that was all done. It was all polarized before anything happened with the gator. But you got to wait it out. You can't photograph, particularly wildlife, like you walking through a zoo. You have to wait it out. And if you don't get the shot, that's okay. You heard the birds. You got to chill out. We're out there because we're in love with nature. And if we get a photograph to take home, we're lucky. So when my whole approach changed to that, I started getting better images instead of trying to go out to get the image that looks like somebody else's image. Now I get the images that God presented to me. I do shoot in zoos and some game farm work, but I do workshops at different zoos. Riverbank Zoo in Columbia, South Carolina is a favorite zoo because their tigers are in a really natural setting. From a photography point of view, I could get shots like this. And again, we have to wait for the eye of the tiger. We have to wait for sometimes for them to move into the clear. And it's not uncommon for me to go spend an hour and a half at a zoo. The North Carolina Zoo is 40 minutes from my house. Nikon sends me a new lens to test. I'm in the car. If I'm home working in the office, I'm in the car going to test the lens at the North Carolina Zoo. And but when I go, I pick a subject. Maybe it's lions. In this case, it was tigers. Sometimes it's the giraffes or the rhinos or the elephants. And that's what I work. I don't walk through the zoo like a tourist. I pick a subject and I work it. And I wait for it to be clearly defined so I could create an image. Meanwhile, in between, when I don't have an image, people walking through, if they need help with their cameras, I get to help them with their cameras. So it's still a benefit. So yeah, just wait for that clearly defined and wait for great light. Wait for great light.
And someone from the audience said, I love the comment. I get the pictures that God presents to me.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Somebody asked me why I do all this. I was a design engineer for a long time. I used to design radar components for the military. I worked on Space Shuttle, F-18, Aegis, AWACS, those that might have some knowledge of those things. They know that's pretty complex. Lots of calculations, and I have a background in engineering and a background in physics. But now I do photography, and I'm not that type of engineer anymore. And people say, why? Well, I learned how to make less money by being a professional photographer than I used to make. Not about the money. To me, it's about being out there and bringing back an image of God's creation. So I'm not going to turn this into that direction, but that's why I do this. I want somebody to see my image and want to go see it for themselves. And if my image does that, it did a good job. Here, we talk about clearly defined subjects. I spent about an hour and a half with this bobcat in Merritt Island. He was up in a tree and he was buried in the back. All I could see is fur. And I stayed and he moved a little bit forward. And I finally got that top shot with a big leaf in front of his head. Well, then I moved my feet. And one of the best camera adjustments is to move your feet and get a better composition. But it had some, it was at the end of the day, there was some great light on her. And then her head came into the clear. Now, a lot of times you would say, well, you got the shot, and she stayed there, and the head was in clear, but how many shots could you get of that? But I waited and waited and waited. And by the way, see, I used the polarizer. It took the sheen off the leaves, which would have been distracting from the cat if if I had reflections and stuff on those leaves. So I had opportunities to polarize and I took it, but I waited and waited and waited. And right before I was ready to give up, I got this one. And that's the winner. But I needed to be patient. I needed to wait. I needed to wait for her to be clearly defined. I couldn't just say, wow, I saw a bobcat and I took pictures and she was buried way in the back. This was my Z9, shot at about 1/800th of a second. This was handheld. With my 500, 5.6 actually PF. And I had, a polarizer on there. But you have to give it time to do. Even here, this
when you're using a long telephoto lens, do you use a polarizer, and is it mounted in the rear filter holder of the lens?
when I'm using the larger lenses that I used to use when I was shooting SLRs, like my 600 f4, my 400 2.8, yeah, that polarizer was mounted in the rear. The lens I'm using with my mirrorless is a 500 PF right now, the 500 PF is very hand holdable, but I do occasionally put that on the Wimbley head in the gimbal, especially if I'm sitting and waiting long periods of time. When I was in Glacier not too long ago, photographing moose out in the pond, I did have it on a gimbal head just because I didn't want to hold it all the time. But the VR is so good in the Z9 and in the lenses and the new Canon systems, the new Sony systems, that shooting handheld. My rule is this: I'm shooting a 500 millimeter lens. I need to be someplace at or above 1/500th of a second. Don't panic. I had a couple of people say, well, I'm going to shoot at 1/2000th of a second. And then as the light went down, they're shooting at ISO 12,000. And the images get a little, no matter how good we get, they're obviously going to be a little more grainy. You don't need to shoot that fast. You need to develop a technique. And for either holding it, still or putting it back on a tripod. I'm able to hold it pretty still. A lens with VR or the 5-axis VR in my Z9, I could hold a 200 millimeter lens down to a 30th of a second and get sharp images. Now, I don't try to do that, but if I have to, I will. This image I was pointing out that sometimes there's two subjects, this one, the tree, and along with the blue herring, but there's great light. There's great light in the background. The 500 PF compressed the background well enough where it turned into a palette. I used a polarizing filter because the light was coming from the right, and it really popped the light around, the beak as well as on the tree. You could see the detail, but it's clearly defined. You know that the main subject is really the bird, even though the tree is bigger because of the separation. And so you need to be aware of all that. Using foreground and background. My wife this is my older granddaughter, and she likes to go shooting. Sometimes we're in Kate's Cove. More of a fun trip, but she's doing photography. She was shooting this sunset, and so I photographed her, photographing the sunset. But what I like about it, for this program, we talk about foreground and background. That fence line, as well as where she's set up, forms a leading line. So I'm using the foreground to the background, even though she's a main subject and the sun and a starburst is the second subject, that foreground to background thing is being used effectively to bring you into the scene. You could almost feel yourself walking along that road, and that's what I wanted to do here. I did use my Vinny Colucci extended grad, which is dark on top and graduates longer than a standard grad into the foreground, so I could keep her exposed, even though she was obviously backlit. You could see the rim lighting around her, and I used a little tone mapping. Basically I pulled up some shadows and stuff. You could tell it almost has that artistic look. But yeah, the foreground to background. And by the way, I used f/22. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. f/22, because that's what helped creates the sunburst. Otherwise, typically in the landscape, I never go past f/16. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Like now. using foreground to background. Excuse me 1 minute. Using foreground to background here. I wanted to create the foreground to background to lead you into the scene. This is the fort down in St. Augustine, and to do this, I needed a flow. It's almost turns into an S turn from the left corner. Look at the great light, first building block. The subject is the fort, clearly defined. There's lots of little supporting subjects around it. And I'm using the foreground, the background to bring you into the scene. And this is how I set it up. You can see the camera settings. When you're doing a landscape and you need everything in focus, the way a camera physics works, probably promise not to get more technical than what you're seeing here, is that if you focus about a third up the scene, if it was vertical, same thing, third up the scene, a third in front at f16, between f11 and f16, and a third behind will be in focus. So I focus somewhere along that brick layer, and at f16, everything is sharp. That being said, when do you use f22? Even though you increase the depth of field going to f22 and f32, our lens starts to degrade. Our lens are typically sharpest somewhere around f8. As we stop down to f16 to get this big depth of field for landscapes, it starts to deteriorate, but the depth of field grows so much, you can tolerate the deterioration. If you get past f22, it starts to fall off. The images actually get a little softer. So my magic number is at f16, about a third up into the scene, 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind, perfectly in focus. This is just another example using a foreground to background effectively. This was, sun had gone down. This is over Pamlico Sound. And I used the silhouette of the darkness in the foreground to make you feel like you had to walk down this boardwalk to get out to the water to see all that beautiful light back there. Foreground to background. In this case, the foreground was the shadows of the clouds, and I used the grass line as a silhouette. You can see I used a 3-stop grad because it was a little bright up in the sky, and I wanted to balance it with the foreground. In this case, the polarizer didn't have an effect because the sun had just gone down behind those back trees, but the polarizer almost acted like an ND filter, which helped chill that water out and smooth that water out just a little bit. But the foreground to background, the light, it's clearly defined. It's not cluttered. These are the building blocks we're talking about to make a great image. Top image up on the Smokies. I love the leading line. I've been photographing that barn up by Grandfather Mountain in North Carolina probably since 1994. And I've shot this with a film X-Pan, which was a panoramic camera. I've shot it with digital. This was with my Z9 this past fall. And my wife and I were up scouting for a workshop and photographing. But foreground to background, you see where the fence comes out of the corner? That's a leading line. It makes you feel like you need to walk that fence to get to the barn. You want to bring people into your scene, foreground to background. Down below, where we had this nice line in Price Lake of color, it was the color palette that caught my eye, but it came from left to right. It was a nice foreground to background. And what we did there, remember I talked about a third up? Just like on the fence, about a third up, I focused there, F16, boom. Down below, it was hard to focus a third up because it was hard to lock on focus on reflective trees in the water. So I did cheat a little bit, and I found something up in that left-hand corner that was a little higher than a third, but I didn't care because I knew that the color palette in the water was going to be not sharp anyways. It needed to be a color palette. But that's basically how I set that one up. Polarizing filter is always on my lens, so it helps slow the shutter speed down. But I use the 3-stop ND filter to help tame the sky into the foreground. foreground to background. Sometimes you eliminate the foreground. In this case, I do this a lot with wildlife. I drop the background out because I'll shoot wide open. In this case, it was a 70 to 200, 2.8 shot at 2.8. Background turned to a nice color palette. This was a zoo shot. This was at Columbia Zoo, actually, I think. And the telephoto lens compresses. So I'm not using a foreground at all. I got rid of it, but I'm using the background effectively here. You get to make that choice as a photographer. Same thing here, foreground to background being used. I'm keeping an eye on some time here, so I know I got to pick it up a little bit. I get into my stories. It's like, I'm sorry. Looking Glass Falls. Now we're talking about conditions. We talked about, oh, I'm sorry, went backwards. Conditions have to be right for the subject. Like here, it had to be a cold day. I wanted to show cold. So going out, if you wanted to photograph flags, you can't go out on a calm day. They're all hanging, limp. You got to go out on a windy day so the flag is sticking out. What conditions do we have here? We're picking conditions. This was in Montana. We were photographing at a working ranch, and they ran these horses, and the conditions are that it's snowing out. They're kicking up snow. Couldn't do this in the middle of summer and get that image. So you got to pick the conditions that you want, or alter the conditions. This was a sunrise shot after sunrise on a beach. We put some shells out there and used in this case a Singh-Ray more slow 5-stop to get a really slow shutter speed. So we changed the conditions a little bit to get that milky wave action. But again, we needed good light, early morning light, the whole thing. Subjects clearly defined. We even have movement in our subject now. We have this moving water, and we can recognize motion. In this case, we changed the conditions with filters, but we need to know the conditions we need. Early morning fog in Colucci, you can't get this at 4 in the afternoon. You can get great light 4 in the afternoon, but you have to go there before sunrise. Let the mist start to rise. Another condition. Snow. By the way, when you're shooting, particularly when I'm shooting in snow, I always leave my white balance set to cloudy. I'll leave it set to cloudy anyway. I like that warm look, but it takes that blue out that sometimes you get when you shoot snow scenes. So you might want to, if you're the type of person that likes to do auto white balance, put it on a specific white balance. Try shooting wildlife and nature with a cloudy white balance, even in the sunshine, because it'll give you a little extra warmth. But when we look for conditions like calm weather and great light, even at night, the moonlight coming through the clouds gave me great light. Polarizing even at night here, controlled reflections in the water. So one of the conditions that are important. So as we come into conclusion and we look at our images, critique yourself. Did our image include all 4 keys? This is in Yellowstone, bison. Most dangerous animal in Yellowstone is not the grizzly bear. It's not the moose. It's these guys. They'll run you down in a heartbeat. Is there good light? Is the subject clearly defined? Do we have foreground and background helping us? And again, the conditions have to be right to get this smooth water. It's got to be calm. We got to look at these. Does our image tell a story? There's something happening that you could create a story in your mind to show somebody. The 4 keys are always changing because light changes, sometimes conditions change. You got to keep this all in mind as you're going for your image. Make sure your image makes your viewer want to go see it for themselves, that it captivates your viewer, but make sure it has all 4 elements: great light, clearly defined, foreground to background working for you, and that you're using the right conditions. In this case, a nice sunny afternoon in the Smokies. Then your image did a good job. Lastly, think out of the box. Some of those extra computer features like multiple exposure and all that stuff, experiment with them. This was the sequoia trees in California. I got bored taking tree shots, so I created something out of the box. Have fun, stay safe, And we have a little time to spare for more questions if there is any.
Awesome. I actually love that photo of the bison from Yellowstone. It reminds me when I went to Yellowstone, I think I had a half a memory card full of bison picture. It was almost like a joke amongst the family, like not another bison photo. But at the end of the trip, I had like 2 or 3 really good bison photos. I framed one, I put one on a blanket. Like they were really, those were good images. And I think it was worth half a memory card to get there.
Mhm. I love photo. Just one quick story. I was photographing with um, another instructor, and we were out scouting. What I typically do if I'm running a photography event, I'm there a couple of days before. For one, to get my images, because I don't shoot that much when I'm teaching, because that's not what you paid me to do. You paid me to teach you. But we're out scouting to find those locations before the group showed up. And I'm photographing a bison with a wide angle lens. And um, she's a dear, actually, she's my sister-in-law now. That's how I met Annette. She used to teach with me. Her name is Melissa Southern. And she's standing on the roof of the car because I didn't realize how close the bison was getting to me with the super wide angle lens. And she's yelling at me, get in the car, get in the car. And I'm snapping away. And I pulled my head up, and I never get close to wildlife on purposely, but sometimes they come upon you. And I pulled my head up, and it felt like I was almost nose to nose. So I backed away carefully and got in the car. Yeah, bisons are the most dangerous animals in Yellowstone.
So we have a couple of questions from the chat. We didn't talk a lot about grads, but someone said it's difficult to use an ND grad in mirrorless. Can you talk about your technique for using graduated ND filters?
Okay, graduated ND filters with my Z6. I started with the Z7, Z6, and I'm shooting Z6 II and a Z9, but they're all mirrorless. I haven't had a problem using them once I develop patience. And I think what they're talking about is when you look through, and I don't, unless I'm doing something special like teaching and showing, I don't use the monitor to look at my images because the light changes everything unless I'm put a big blanket over my head. But I do look at stuff in the viewfinder. I look through my viewfinder just like I did with my SLRs. The problem is most mirrorless cameras, there's a delay. So when you polarize, you got to wait a little bit to see what happens. That's why I like to pre-polarize, like this shot of this deer running across this little island that was out in the water. I've already polarized that direction, and he ran into my scene. So you have to be a little patient. And I know with my Z6, there was quite a bit of a delay when I, let's say, used a grad filter and I inched it down just a little at a time. I'd have to wait, CD effect, and then CD effect, and then CD effect. As I've gotten the Z6 II, big improvement on that. The Z9, it's almost like I'm shooting an SLR. I see the effect right away. And I just treat it like an SLR now. Now, I don't know, I have had some people with other manufacturer cameras, the earlier ones. I'm sure the new Canons and Sonys are just up there with the Z6 II and or might even exceed the Z6 II and the Z9. I just get to play with those cameras when I'm on a workshop when people bring them. I have a tendency to collect more Nikon people because of my background in Nikon, but I do get Canon shooters and I do get Sony shooters and I get Fuji shooters. And that little delay is what I think this person's talking about. So you got to be patient and let that delay happen. And when you're doing a sunrise or if you're doing any type of scenic, you have time for that delay. And I leave my histogram on, my live histogram in the viewfinder. So as it's happening, as I'm pulling that filter down in front of the lens, I could keep a right eye on that histogram to make sure I'm not blowing something out or underexposing something. Because unlike what people think, I do shoot sometimes a little underexposed, but if you go too far underexposed, when you brighten things up in software, then you're going to get a lot of digital noise. So you really want your exposures right. That's really key to coming home with some good images also. So I don't know if that helps, but my technique was to wait. I used to shoot a Fuji X-T1 for a while, just when Nikon didn't have mirrorless, and I found that the delay was a long time compared to today's cameras. And, you know, I'm sure the XT3 and 4 are much better than my XT1 was. But yeah, you're going to have to watch that effect carefully in your viewfinder.
In your dual photos in color and infrared at Cades Cove, did you use a fully converted camera for both images?
Nope. The color photo was just a straight camera. That was just a normal image using whatever filters I used back then. Let's see if we can go find that. And the infrared image that we looked at, just this is slow the way it does it. Oh, I missed it. There we go. There we go again. Should be coming up. The infrared image was the Singh-Ray iRay 830 filter. The 830 infrared filter, you take a standard camera and you put that filter in front, and there's techniques to it. So I'm simplifying it, and you do no conversion to the camera. The disadvantage with that filter, and I love the black and white look of what that filter does, is it's going to be a long exposure, anywhere between 5 minutes and 8 minutes long at f8, depending on how your particular sensor reacts. With the Nikon cameras, if somebody said, I got this Nikon, doesn't matter what it is, every single time I just say start at f8, ISO 800 or 1000, someone's in there, 5 minute exposure, and they almost nail that exposure every time. That's just the Nikon. Now, it's a little different for Canon sensors, but not much different. So it might be a little longer, a little less. So you got to experiment a little bit. But my settings, which are now my little setup settings, I think now come with the instruction set for the infrared 830 filter when Singh-Ray sends them out. You don't have to do any conversion at all, none whatsoever. On the left, that was polarizing filter. And I shot this in vivid. I wanted to see how vivid would look. I typically shoot in standard. I shot it in vivid because I want to simulate like when I shot Velveeta back in film days, which really gave you this type of look, this really poppy look. And I happen to like it to get that look. But no, all I used was polarizing filter and a regular camera. None of my cameras are converted. I might buy a used Z6 or something, convert it just to have one. But no, this is all done with filters.
And I think this might be the last one. How often and under what conditions do you use the Wimberley?
Well, before the VR got so great within the last 5 to 7 years, I used the Wimberley head every time I was doing any type of large telephoto work. I probably used my tripod and head, either the ball head or the Wimberley head, 95% of the time. Now I'm probably shooting on a tripod for all my landscapes, but my wildlife is probably 50-50, and it really depends on birds in flight. I strictly handhold now. It's just easier to track them. I've gotten good enough to get the autofocus bead on the bird, shoot a short burst, and if I shoot 10 images, 8 of them are sharp, 7 of them are sharp. I might lose 1 or 2 or 3 where I missed getting the autofocus. But let me give you a trick for birds. Even if I had a 5.6 or an f4 lens or a 2.8 lens, I don't shoot wide open for birds in flight because you can't get the sensor on the eye of the bird. You can't do that with an eagle flying by at 30 miles an hour to pick up a fish. So you have to aim for the body. So I shoot, the old engineer in me doesn't allow me to go to f8. I shoot at 7.1. My aperture set to 7.1 because if I can get the back shoulder of the wing or the body of the bird, the depth of field will pull the sharpness in on the head of the bird. So then I only have to worry about a bird in flight, getting the autofocus sensor on the bird. Once I fire with dynamic autofocus, the camera does a great job. Even if I come off of the focus for a split second, there's 500 other sensors that maintain that focus long enough that it gives me a chance to catch up with the bird again. The trick is when you shoot the burst, whether it's a shorter or longer burst, don't lift your finger off the shutter and start over again because you have to reacquire. When you start the burst, let the camera dynamic autofocus. It's different manufacturers use different terms. But the let it do its job, and you'll have less throwaways. As soon as you release the shutter, then the camera has to reacquire all over again. You're going to get more misses. And that's whether if I'm on the Wimberley head or hand holding.
Okay, I think that's it for questions.
Okay.
I do invite you to check out Vinny's website. He is listed as one of our ambassadors on the Singh-Ray website, so easy to find that way. I also, just a personal note, I would recommend finding him on Facebook. He and his wife will go out and often shoot the same subject matter, and they'll do these he saw, she saw photo posts, and it'll be the same subject matter, but two completely different takes. And I find those particular posts are very inspirational to me anyway.
Well, we're actually designing hopefully a webinar for Singh-Ray that's just that. He said, she said, just to show that, and hopefully
There's
that.
no right or wrong image. I love that.
Yeah, well, she's always right.
And that's what makes you a good husband.
Well, I get the last word, and you know what it is? Yes, dear. And that's it.
So I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Thank you, Vinny, for joining us and sharing your expertise. We'll get this recording out shortly. And again, any final words, Vinny, or?
Yeah, my email's been on here, and you get my email off the website. If you have questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. I'm not going to send you an invoice to give you an answer. If I don't know it, I will find out or find somebody that could help you. I don't want anybody being stagnated in their photography because they're afraid to ask what they think is a stupid question. There are no stupid questions. Please, and even if you needed to set up a time where we have to chat on the phone, I get emails every week where I'm helping people set up their camera settings so they can get certain type of shots. So don't hesitate to reach out to me.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Good night.